The film set was alive with noise and movement. People were rushing from one corner to another carrying equipment, wires, cameras, and props. Everyone had their task, and everyone moved quickly, because time on set was money and every second mattered. In the middle of all this busy chaos, there was one man who walked in with a calm step and a gentle smile. Keanu Reeves. Keanu was known by everyone, not just as a movie star but as a man who never acted bigger than others. The makeup artists smiled when they saw him, the lighting crew waved, and even the security guards straightened proudly when he passed. He nodded at each of them, greeting them with warmth. He was dressed simply, not in expensive clothes but in casual wear, the kind of outfit anyone could wear. Yet when he entered the set, it was like the room lit up. The director watched him walk in and felt a small relief. Directors often carried the weight of the whole production on their shoulders, but with Keanu, things always felt easier. He was professional, never caused drama, and treated the entire crew with respect. Unlike some actors who demanded luxury, trailers, and endless attention, Keanu was the type who would sit with the crew at lunch and share stories. That morning, though, something felt different. The air on set carried a strange energy. The director noticed some new faces in the background. Extras were common, people hired to stand in the crowd for certain scenes. They usually sat quietly, reading books or scrolling on their phones until the assistant director called them. But a few of these extras did not look relaxed. They stood a little apart, whispering to each other and glancing often toward the entrance. Keanu, unaware of this small detail, moved toward the wardrobe area to get ready for the next scene. He passed by a group of camera operators and stopped to thank them for their hard work the day before. One of them had stayed late adjusting a difficult angle, and Keanu remembered it. That was his way. He never forgot the effort of the people around him. The crew loved him for it. He wasn't just a star, he was a team member. On the sidelines, two extras exchanged a look. Their eyes narrowed as Keanu laughed with the cameraman. They weren't interested in the movie. They weren't practicing their roles or waiting for direction. Their attention was locked only on Keanu. One of them adjusted the sleeve of his coat, hiding something metallic that caught the light for a second. No one else noticed. The crew was too focused on their work. The assistant director shouted instructions, moving people into position. Lights dimmed. Cameras were prepared. The sound of claps and chatter filled the set as the scene was about to begin. Keanu returned, now in costume, ready to act. His face showed focus, but also that calmness he always carried. He greeted the extras politely, some of whom smiled nervously, while the two strange men avoided his eyes. The director, sitting behind the monitor, felt something was wrong but couldn't place it. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. The stress of filming long hours could make anyone suspicious, but this time it felt real. Something about the atmosphere wasn't right. His eyes moved across the extras, and for a second he thought he saw one of them whisper too sharply. It was not the way normal extras behaved, but before he could say anything, the clapperboard snapped, and the scene began. The cameras rolled. As Keanu stepped into the shot, his voice steady, his body moving in rhythm with the rehearsed lines, he delivered his dialogue with the same dedication he always had. Whether it was a blockbuster moment or a quiet conversation, but behind the lights in the crowd meant only to fill the background. The two men exchanged another look. This was not going to be just another normal day on set. Crew members laughed quietly as the director called cut and reset the scene. They moved about adjusting props, fixing hair, and preparing for another take. The laughter and chatter filled the room. But under that noise, danger was quietly growing. Keanu, still unaware, thanked a young assistant who brought him water. She smiled shyly, unable to believe she was speaking to him. That was the effect he had on people. He made them feel comfortable, like they belonged. At that moment, no one could imagine what was about to happen. No one could guess that within a few minutes the set would fall into shock. The extras would no longer be extras, and Keanu would be forced to respond in a way that no scriptwriter had prepared. His reaction on that day would not just save the moment. It would change everything. The air grew heavy as the next scene was lined up. The crew moved as usual, but those who were closest to the extras noticed them standing stiffly, eyes sharp, hands hidden. One man clenched his jaw as if preparing himself. The director leaned forward, his instinct screaming that something was about to break the normal flow. Keanu stood center stage, ready for his mark. The lights dimmed and brightened, the cameras locked onto him. Everyone believed they were about to witness another piece of movie magic. But what they were truly about to witness was something no one would ever forget. The cameras were being adjusted, the crew fixing the lights and people moving in and out of the frame. On the surface, everything looked normal. It was just another day of filming. But in the background, hidden behind the chatter and laughter, something darker was building. Among the crowd of extras, there were faces no one really noticed at first. Faces that didn't quite belong. Extras were usually relaxed. Some sat down on chairs between takes. Some sipped water, and some read books, or scrolled through their phones. They were there to fill space, to make the scene look alive. Most of them were excited just to see Keanu Reeves in person. Some even whispered about how polite he was. But a few men stood apart, not acting like the others. They didn't laugh, they didn't relax, and they certainly didn't seem interested in the movie being filmed. One of them had sharp eyes that kept following Keanu everywhere he went. The man's body was stiff, his shoulders tight. His hands kept shifting inside his coat pocket. Another leaned toward him and whispered quickly. Their lips moved, but no one could hear over the noise of the set. The assistant director was too busy shouting directions to notice, and the other extras, focused on doing their job, paid no attention to these small details. Keanu, meanwhile, was walking through the set, greeting people with a soft smile. He didn't know that two pairs of eyes were tracking his every move. For him, it was just another day at work. He thanked a costume assistant for fixing his jacket. He even paused to hold the door open for a crew member carrying heavy equipment. The crew adored him for his kindness. He was the star. Yet he acted like an ordinary man. But to those strangers in the crowd, his kindness meant nothing. Their gazes were not filled with admiration but with some kind of frustration. One of them muttered, shaking his head. He looked at Keanu as if blaming him for something. His jaw tightened, his breath heavy. The other man patted him on the shoulder, as if reminding him to stay calm. Yet their eyes burned with a determination that didn't belong to background performers. The director sat near the monitors, watching the scene being prepared. He rubbed his forehead. He had done hundreds of shoots, but years of experience gave him a sense for when something was wrong. And right now, something was wrong. He couldn't explain it. But the air felt heavy. His eyes scanned the extras and landed on those two men. For a moment, he frowned. They weren't looking at their marks, they weren't listening to instructions. Their focus was entirely on Keanu. The director leaned toward his assistant. "Do we know those guys?" he asked quietly. The assistant shrugged, flipping through the list of hired extras. "They're on the list," he replied. "Booked last night, local hires." The director nodded slowly, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. Something about their posture, their energy, didn't sit right with him. He thought about telling security, but before he could, the call for action echoed through the set. The clapperboard snapped and the scene began. Keanu stepped into his position. His presence shifted the entire room. The man had a way of making even silence look powerful. His co-star delivered lines, and Keanu responded naturally. His expression carried emotion, his voice steady. It was easy to forget the cameras, easy to feel like you were watching real life instead of a movie. That was the magic of his acting. But while the rest of the crew watched the scene through the monitor, those two men didn't care about the performance. Their eyes flicked back and forth, watching Keanu, watching the distance between him and them. One of them tapped his foot, his hand still buried deep inside his coat. The other licked his lips nervously. His heart pounded so hard it was almost visible in his chest. The scene ended, and the director shouted, "Cut." The crew clapped politely. Some rushed to adjust props for the next shot. A makeup artist hurried forward with a brush to fix Keanu's face. He smiled at her, thanking her gently. The extras were told to reset positions, but those two men didn't move. They stayed frozen, standing too close together, whispering again, their movements sharp, unlike the relaxed body language of the others. One of the camera operators caught their strange behavior and frowned. He nudged his partner, pointing subtly. "Those guys don't look right," he whispered. The partner glanced but shook his head, brushing it off. "Extras are always weird." He said, "Don't overthink it." Yet the first operator couldn't shake the feeling. His gut told him something was coming, something that didn't belong in a safe film set. Meanwhile, Keanu was readying himself for the next take. He picked up a prop and practiced the movement, laughing softly when he dropped it once. His natural humility made the crew laugh with him. He never acted superior, never let mistakes ruin his mood. But as he turned toward his mark, his eyes unknowingly passed over the two men. They stared back at him, their gazes locked and unblinking. For the first time, Keanu felt something unusual. It was just a moment, a flash, but he sensed the intensity in their eyes. He tilted his head slightly as if to check again, but before, he could look longer. The assistant director shouted instructions, pulling him back into the rhythm of filming. Keanu shook it off, assuming maybe they were just nervous fans. Yet the director, still uneasy, leaned back in his chair. He tapped his pen against the table. His instincts screamed louder. The two men were not blending in. They were waiting, building up courage, preparing for something no one else saw coming. The cameras rolled again, lights blazing, actors in motion. The world inside the movie continued as normal, but the world outside the script was shifting. Those men weren't extras. They were shadows in the crowd, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the background and into Keanu's life. And when they did, nothing on that set would ever be the same again. The set was busy again, people rushing to prepare for the next shot. The director gave last-minute instructions, the sound crew checked their mics, and the assistant director moved the extras back into position. On the surface, it all looked ordinary, but tension was hiding in plain sight. The two men who had been whispering and watching Keanu the whole morning now stood closer to him, their shoulders tight and eyes sharp. Keanu, calm as always, was rehearsing a line with his co-star. He laughed at a small mistake and encouraged her kindly. His natural charm lifted the mood of the people around him. He didn't notice the two strangers inching forward. Crew members nearby were too distracted with their work to see anything unusual. They were fixing props, adjusting lights, and preparing for the camera's movement. The clapperboard snapped. "Action!" The assistant director called. Keanu moved into his role, delivering his lines with focus. The cameras captured his face, his body language, the way he filled the scene with emotion. For the audience, it would one day look like perfect cinema. But behind the cameras, real life was about to break into the story. One of the men clenched his fist, his breathing was heavy. His hand slipped inside his coat, gripping the metallic object hidden there. The other gave him a quick nod. It was the signal. In a sudden burst, they pushed past the line of extras, knocking one of them to the floor. Gasps erupted across the set. The entire room froze for a heartbeat, no one believing what they were seeing. "Hey!" a crew member shouted, dropping the clipboard in shock. The director stood up from his chair so fast it almost fell over. The extras panicked, scattering backward. Some screamed, others covered their mouths. The camera kept rolling for a few seconds before the operator realized it wasn't part of the script and stopped. The studio lights glared down, making the scene look even more unreal. Keanu turned, confusion flashing across his face. He saw the men rushing toward him, faces tight with anger. One of them shoved a stuntman out of the way, sending him crashing. Into the set wall, another swung his arm, knocking props to the ground with a loud clatter. It was chaos. Pure chaos. The makeup artist shrieked and ran behind the lighting rig. An assistant tripped over cables trying to get away. Security guards weren't close enough yet. They had been stationed outside, assuming the set was safe. The director shouted for them, his voice breaking with panic, but the attackers were already too close. Keanu's co-star stepped back, her eyes wide in fear. She froze, unable to move. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. His instinct wasn't to panic, but to steady himself. He raised his hands slightly, as if to calm both the attackers and the terrified crew. His face was serious, not angry, not afraid, but focused. The first man lunged at him, pushing through the final gap between them. The sound of chairs crashing and people screaming filled the room. Everyone expected Keanu to fight back, to defend himself like the action heroes he played in movies. Instead, his voice cut through the chaos, calm and strong. "Stop," he said. His words were firm, but not aggressive. The suddenness of his reaction shocked everyone. Even the attackers paused for half a second. Their bodies were shaking with adrenaline, yet his steady tone seemed to hold them in place. The silence was thin, fragile, and it lasted only a moment. Then the second man stepped forward, shouting something no one could understand over the noise. His voice cracked with desperation, not just rage. The crew didn't know what to do. Some ducked behind cameras, others pulled out their phones to call for help. The director waved his arms, screaming at people to move back. The stuntmen, trained to fight in movies, were frozen too. They knew this wasn't choreography. This was real danger. The two men circled closer, one gripping his coat tightly, the other breathing hard like he had been holding back for too long. Their eyes weren't just filled with anger. They carried years of frustration, bitterness, and pain. For them, this moment wasn't about a movie. It was about being seen, being heard, and Keanu was at the center of it. In those tense seconds, the entire set changed. It wasn't Hollywood anymore. It wasn't lights and cameras and scripts. It was raw, unpredictable reality. People watched from behind equipment, trembling. The buzzing of the lights seemed louder, the echo of every step heavier. The two attackers were close enough to touch Keanu now. Yet in the middle of all this, Keanu didn't take a step back. He didn't shout or run. His calmness spread like a wave, confusing the attackers. He spoke again, this time softer. "Talk to me," he said. The words hung in the air, almost unbelievable in a situation where everyone expected fists and violence. One of the attackers shook, his jaw tight. His hand trembled inside the coat. The other's lips pressed together as if holding back tears instead of words. The crew held their breath, not knowing what would happen next. Security finally burst through the doors, but they were too far to stop what was unfolding. The next decision, the next second, belonged only to Keanu and the men standing in front of him. The ambush had turned the safe film set into a storm of fear and uncertainty, but Keanu's reaction wasn't fear. It was something entirely different, something that would change the way everyone on that set remembered that day for the rest of their lives. The air inside the set was heavy. People had frozen in their spots. Some extras had already run for the doors while others crouched behind props. The sound of metal hitting the floor echoed where someone had dropped equipment in fear. The director's voice cracked as he shouted for security, but the men were already there, only a few steps away from Keanu. Everyone expected violence. They expected Keanu to fight or to try to escape, but what he did next left the entire room stunned. Keanu didn't run. He didn't lash out or raise his voice. Instead, he stood tall and calm. His hands were raised slightly, not like a man surrendering, but like a man asking for peace. His voice, steady and clear, cut through the chaos. "It's okay," he said softly. The sound carried farther than anyone thought it could. It wasn't the tone of panic. It wasn't fear. It was control. The two men, their chests heaving, hesitated. They had rushed forward full of anger, ready to cause a scene. But the moment Keanu spoke, they slowed. Their eyes locked with his, confusion flickering across their faces. It was as if they expected him to shout, to fight, to do what an action hero would do in a movie. Instead, they found a man who didn't see them as enemies. His calmness unsettled them. The crew watched in disbelief. A makeup artist whispered, "Why isn't he moving?" Clutching her brush to her chest, a camera operator froze, still holding the camera though it wasn't recording anymore. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The tension was unbearable. And yet, in the middle of it, Keanu looked almost peaceful. He took one slow step forward, not backward. His eyes never left the attackers. His voice came again, low but firm. "You don't need to do this," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. They didn't come from fear. They came from empathy. Keanu wasn't trying to overpower them, he was trying to reach them. One of the men gritted his teeth. His hand twitched near his coat, but it shook as if unsure. The other looked around, suddenly noticing the dozens of eyes watching them. The extras hiding, the the crew trembling, the director frozen. It dawned on him that they had all the attention they wanted, but it wasn't the way they had imagined it. Keanu could see their hesitation. He understood something in that moment that others didn't. He knew anger often came from pain, from feeling invisible. He had lived through loss himself. He had known grief and loneliness. He recognized that look in their eyes. It wasn't pure hatred. It was desperation. "Talk to me," Keanu said again. His voice softened as though he was speaking to a friend instead of two strangers rushing him. He lowered his hands slightly, showing he wasn't afraid, showing he wasn't about to strike. The men blinked, surprised. Their breaths grew uneven, as if the fire inside them was colliding with a wall of calm they couldn't break through. Behind them, the crew stayed frozen, waiting for security to arrive. But even before help could step in, something had already shifted. The storm in the attacker's eyes began to falter. The first man's shoulders dropped a little. His jaw clenched hard, like he was holding back words that had been buried for years. The second man's eyes shimmered with something that looked almost like tears. Keanu's calmness wasn't just stopping them from moving forward. It was reaching inside them. It was pulling at whatever pain they carried. The silence in the room became heavy, but not sharp anymore. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of people waiting for something to break. "Why here?" Keanu asked softly. "Why now?" His words weren't angry. They were curious, gentle, the kind of question someone asks when they genuinely want to understand. The crew couldn't believe what they were hearing. This was not a movie script. This was not acting. This was real. And Keanu was standing in front of danger, treating it like a conversation. The first man finally spoke. His voice cracked and raw. "Nobody listens," he muttered. His words barely audible, but the room caught them. The second nodded quickly, as if the sentence explained everything. They weren't hardened criminals. They weren't professionals. They were just broken men trying to be noticed. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression never changing from calm understanding. "I hear you," he said. And somehow, those three words carried more power than any punch or fight scene could have. The men looked at him, truly looked, as if no one had ever said that to them before. The crew began to relax just slightly. They still waited for security, still clutched props and equipment as if shields, but now their fear was mixed with awe. They were watching something they would never forget. They were watching a man choose compassion over fear. Keanu kept his body still, his breathing steady. He knew sudden movements could break the fragile balance. He knew shouting could push them back into anger. So he stayed calm, a steady presence in the storm. His voice was their anchor, and slowly, the energy in the room shifted. When security finally arrived, rushing onto the set with heavy footsteps, they stopped in confusion. They had expected chaos. They had expected to pull Keanu away from violence. Instead, they saw him standing calmly, speaking gently to two men who were trembling more than raging. It wasn't fists or force that held the moment together. It was compassion. The ambush had turned the set into chaos, but Keanu's calm had turned chaos into something else, something no one had ever expected. The crew realized they weren't just watching a star anymore. They were watching a man reveal the kind of strength that doesn't come from fighting, but from understanding. And in that moment, everyone knew this day would be remembered not for the danger, but for the way Keanu faced it. With calm in the chaos, the room was frozen in silence. Every crew member stood stiff, waiting for something to happen. The security team at the door hesitated, unsure whether to rush in or to let Keanu handle it. The two men who had stormed forward were still breathing heavily, their shoulders rising and falling. Their eyes darted around, filled with confusion, anger, and desperation. They had expected a fight. They had expected shouting, maybe even fists, but instead, they were facing a man who spoke to them like no one else ever had. Keanu's voice was steady, not loud, but it carried weight. "Tell me what's wrong," he said. His tone wasn't demanding. It wasn't accusing. It was patient. It was curious. It was kind. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the attackers looked like they didn't know how to answer. Their lips trembled, Their hands shook as if they were fighting a different kind of battle inside themselves. One of them finally shouted, "Nobody listens to us." His voice cracked with years of frustration. It wasn't the voice of a villain, it was the voice of someone broken, ignored for too long. The other man nodded quickly, adding, "We're tired of being invisible. We're tired of being treated like nothing." Their words spilled out rough and raw, but there was pain in every syllable. The crew exchanged looks, shock spreading across their faces. They realized these weren't trained attackers or dangerous criminals. These were ordinary men who had carried their pain too far. They had turned their anger into an outburst that could have ended badly. But now, with every calm word from Keanu, their rage seemed to unravel. Keanu took a slow breath and spoke again. "I see you," he said gently. "I hear you." Those words hit harder than any security guard could have. The men blinked, their anger weakening as they met his steady eyes. It was like his voice was pulling the weight off their shoulders. Even the crew, who had been terrified only minutes before, began to relax just a little. The director whispered to the assistant beside him, This isn't acting." His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. He knew they were watching something real, something powerful, something no script could have captured. Around him, crew members leaned closer, no one wanting to miss a single word. Keanu continued, his tone never breaking. "You don't need to hurt anyone to be seen," he said. "You don't need violence for your voice to matter." He didn't speak like a star standing above them. He spoke like an equal, a fellow human being. His words had no judgment, only compassion. The first man's lips quivered. He had stormed the set ready to fight, ready to prove a point, but now his eyes filled with something else. Shame. His shoulders dropped slightly, his hands loosened. He looked smaller now, not because Keanu had defeated him, but because Keanu had shown him a mirror. The second man rubbed his face roughly, trying to hide the moisture gathering in his eyes. He had expected rejection, maybe even humiliation. Instead, he found understanding. The extras hiding in the back started whispering. Unable to believe what they were seeing, He's talking them down, one said. "He's not even afraid," another added. The whispers grew into quiet awe. People were realizing they weren't watching a star handle danger. They were watching a man use kindness as his shield. The first man shook his head. "We're nothing, just nothing," he muttered. His voice was low, almost defeated. Keanu stepped closer, closing the space slowly. His movement was careful, measured. "You're not nothing," he said firmly. His words were soft, but they carried a strength that could break through walls. The man's eyes widened as if no one had ever said that to him before. For the crew, time seemed to stop. No cameras rolled, no lights mattered. The movie had vanished. This was something else entirely. This was raw humanity unfolding in front of them. The crew members clutched their equipment like anchors, knowing they would tell this story for the rest of their lives. Security guards exchanged nervous looks, waiting for Keanu's signal. But he didn't need them yet. He had control, not through force, but through words. The two men were no longer lunging forward. They were standing still, their bodies trembling, fighting emotions that were heavier than their anger. Keanu lowered his hands slowly, showing trust. "I know what it feels like to carry pain," he said. His voice was lower now, almost personal. Some of the crew who knew his past, his tragedies, his quiet struggles, felt a chill, because they understood he wasn't lying. He was speaking from experience. That truth gave his words power. The attackers exchanged glances. Their faces weren't twisted in rage anymore. They looked lost, almost broken. One whispered, We just wanted someone to see us." His voice was weak, more like a confession than a threat. The other nodded, biting his lip hard as if to hold back tears, and Keanu gave them what they had wanted all along, acknowledgement. "I see you," he repeated. "The world may have ignored you, but right now you're not invisible. You're here, I'm listening." His voice carried across the set. Everyone who heard it felt the weight of the moment. Silence followed, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't fear anymore. It was relief. It was the sound of anger dissolving. The crew let out shaky breaths, some wiping their eyes without even realizing it. The director leaned back, whispering to himself, "This is going to change everything." The two men lowered their heads, their shoulders slumped. Their anger had turned into exhaustion, and Keanu stood before them, not as an action hero, not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man whose greatest weapon was his compassion. That moment became the turning point. Violence was avoided not by fists or by force, but by words. The kind of words that could reach into the deepest wounds of a human heart and remind it that it still mattered. And the crew knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The tension in the air began to change. Only minutes earlier, the crew had been frozen in terror, waiting for an explosion of violence. But now the atmosphere felt different. The two men who had rushed toward Keanu were no longer charging forward. Their chests were still heaving, their fists still trembling, but their eyes told another story. The anger that had brought them to this moment was beginning to crack, and something else was showing through. Keanu stood in front of them without fear. His calmness was like a mirror reflecting their true emotions back at them. They had come expecting resistance, maybe a fight, but instead they were confronted with patience and understanding. It disarmed them in ways they hadn't prepared for. The first man lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening as if he was fighting back emotions. The second man's lips trembled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The silence in the room was thick. Every crew member could hear their own heartbeat. Some still hid behind equipment. Others stood half-crouched as if ready to run. But none of them moved. They were spellbound, watching the scene unfold like a drama more powerful than any script could write. The director, who had been yelling only minutes before, now stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. He whispered to himself, This is different." Keanu's voice broke the silence again, gentle but steady. "You're hurting," he said, not as a question, but as a truth. His words cut through the men's defenses like a blade of kindness. The first man's shoulders slumped, his breath came out in a shaky rush. He muttered, "Nobody cares." His voice cracked on the last word. The second man let out a low sound that was half a sob. He tried to cover his face with his hand, ashamed of the tears that threatened to fall. The crew exchanged glances. Some of them had tears in their eyes too. They weren't just watching danger anymore. They were watching two men crumble under the weight of their own pain. The extras who had hidden in fear now peeked out, their expressions softening. The makeup artist, who had been trembling, behind a light stand, pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "Oh my God." Keanu took a step closer, slow and steady. His movements showed no aggression, only trust. He spoke again, his tone warm and patient. "I care," he said. "Right now I care. You're not invisible to me." His words were simple, but they carried more weight than shouting or threats ever could. The first man finally looked up. His eyes were red, wet. He clenched his fists tighter, not in anger now, but in shame. His voice broke as he said, We just wanted someone to notice us." His confession filled the entire set, bouncing off the walls like a cry that had been buried for years. The second man, unable to hold back any longer, dropped his hands to his sides, his tears spilling. Freely his body shook, and for the first time he looked less like an attacker and more like a broken human being. Keanu didn't step back. He stayed close, giving them the space to feel. "I see you," he repeated softly. "And I hear you." Those words made the second man cover his face again, this time openly sobbing. The sound of his tears echoed, louder than any shout had earlier. The first man reached out blindly, as if searching for something solid to hold on to, but his hand only met the air. Security guards stood at the edges of the set, unsure whether to intervene. They were ready to drag the men away, but even they could see this wasn't violence anymore. It was something else entirely. The director gave a small shake of his head, silently signaling the guards to wait. Even he knew that Keanu was doing something none of them could. Keanu gently lowered his hands, showing his trust. He didn't need to raise his voice. His calm presence was enough, he said. It's okay to feel this, it's okay to let it out. His compassion broke down the final wall. The first man's face twisted as he fought tears, but he couldn't hold them back. His breathing grew uneven, and then he too broke down. His sobs joined his partner's, raw and painful. The crew looked on, stunned. They had expected a brawl, a scandal, headlines of disaster. Instead, they were witnessing two men collapse under years of unspoken grief and frustration. They weren't dangerous shadows anymore. They were just human beings who had carried too much for too long. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't move away. He let them break. He let them cry. His voice, steady and kind, guided them through it. "You're safe here," he whispered. "Nobody is going to hurt you. Not while I'm here." His words wrapped around the men like a blanket. Their sobbing slowed, their trembling eased. Slowly, the fire in their eyes went out, replaced by exhaustion. The room was so quiet now that the crew could hear every sniff, every shaky breath. One camera operator wiped his own eyes, whispering, "This is the most real thing I've ever seen." The director sat down heavily, his hands trembling. He couldn't believe what he was watching. He had filmed dozens of emotional scenes, but none of them compared to this moment. The two men finally sank to their knees, their bodies weak from the release. They weren't threats anymore, they weren't attackers. They were just two broken men, undone by compassion. The crew slowly stepped out from their hiding places, their fear melting into sympathy. Some extras even began to cry softly, moved by the raw humanity they had witnessed. Keanu stayed near them, calm as ever. He didn't gloat, he didn't act like a hero. He simply stayed, present, offering his silence and his patience. It wasn't the kind of scene Hollywood wrote, but it was the kind of scene the world needed to see. And in that moment, everyone on that set understood. The attackers had not been defeated by force. They had been disarmed by kindness. They had been broken open by a man who chose to listen. Instead of fight, the ambush had begun with fear and anger, but it was ending with tears and compassion. And as the crew stood in awe, they knew they would never forget the day two men broke down, and the man who gave them the space to do it. The set was silent except for the sound of the two men crying. Their shoulders shook as years of anger and loneliness poured out in front of everyone. No one moved for a long moment. Crew members stood frozen, unsure what to do next. Extras peeked. From behind props, eyes wide with shock and disbelief, the security team stayed close, ready to step in. But they hesitated. Something told them this was not the time for force. Something deeper was happening. Keanu looked at the two men on their knees. His expression was calm, his eyes soft. He didn't see them as enemies anymore. He saw two broken souls who had carried too much pain. Instead of demanding they stop, or yelling for guards to drag them out, he did something no one expected. He bent down slightly, his body lowering to their level. It was not the stance of a Hollywood star protecting his image. It was the simple act of a man showing respect. "You've been through a lot," Keanu said quietly. His words weren't dramatic, but they carried more weight than any loud speech could. The first man sniffed hard, his voice shaking as he whispered, "No one cares, we're just nothing." The second man nodded, his tears still streaming. Keanu paused, then slowly reached toward the catering table nearby. He grabbed 2 bottles of water and walked back, placing them gently in the men's hands. The crew gasped softly. It was such a small gesture, but in that moment it felt huge. It wasn't just water. It was acknowledgement. It was kindness at a time when no one else would have thought of it. The men looked down at the bottles their hands confused, almost ashamed. "Drink," Keanu said softly. "You must be tired." His voice was steady, without judgment, without anger. The men obeyed, their hands trembling as they opened the bottles. They drank in silence. Their sobs slowly quieting, the crew watched, stunned by the simplicity of it. Here were 2 men who had just disrupted an entire set, who had scared dozens of people, and instead of punishment, they were being treated with compassion. Keanu then sat down on one of the steps near the set wall. He didn't stand above them, he didn't tower over them, he made himself small, equal, inviting. "Tell me," he said, "what pushed you to this?" His tone was curious, not angry. The men hesitated, but something about his patience loosened their tongues. The first man finally spoke. "We're invisible," he muttered. "Everywhere we go, no one sees us, no one hears us. It's like we don't exist," the second man added. "We thought if we did something crazy, if we got close to you, maybe someone would notice." His words trailed off into shame. He covered his face again, embarrassed by his own honesty. Keanu nodded slowly. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss them. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't need chaos to be noticed," he said softly. "Your life matters without this. You don't need to scare people to be heard." His words were gentle but strong. They carried the weight of truth. And the men listened like children being comforted for the first time. The director standing behind the monitors whispered, "This isn't an actor. This is a human being saving two souls." His assistant wiped her eyes, unable to stop the tears. Around the set, crew members began to step out from their hiding places. Their fear had faded, replaced with something else: respect, awe, even hope. Keanu reached for the catering table again, this time bringing sandwiches. He unwrapped one and placed it in the first man's hands. "Eat," he said. His tone was so ordinary, so caring, it felt like he was offering food to an old friend. The man stared at the sandwich, his lips trembling. Slowly he took a bite, his tears still falling. The other man followed, chewing quietly. The sight moved the crew deeply. It was as if kindness had transformed the entire scene. One extra whispered, "He's treating them like family." Another nodded, "He's not acting, he's just good." Those whispers carried around the room. The fear that had once gripped the set had turned into warmth. The people there would never forget what they were witnessing. As the men ate, Keanu spoke again. "You deserve to be seen, but this is not the way. You deserve peace, not pain." His voice was low, but each word landed with impact. The men nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Their anger had dissolved completely, leaving only tired, broken expressions. Security stepped forward again, waiting for instructions. The director raised his hand to stop them. He understood now that rushing in would break the fragile moment. Instead, everyone let Keanu continue. His approach was working in ways no force could. After a few more minutes, the men finished their food. Their breathing had slowed, their tears had dried. They sat quietly, heads lowered, ashamed but calmer. Keanu stood slowly, offering his hand to each of them. For a moment, they didn't move. Then, with hesitation, they accepted his hands and stood up, their bodies weak but lighter. The entire crew erupted into quiet murmurs. Some clapped softly, some cried. No one could believe what they had just seen. Keanu hadn't just calmed an ambush. He had turned it into a moment of humanity. He had fed the people who had tried to attack him. He had sat with them, listened to them, and reminded them that they mattered. The director whispered to his cameraman, "If only this had been recorded." The cameraman shook his head. No movie would ever compare. The two men, now calmer, were escorted gently by security. Not dragged, not shoved. They didn't resist. They walked with heads lowered. The crew watched in silence, not with hatred, but with compassion, because Keanu had shown them all that even in the face of danger, kindness could win. And as the set slowly returned to normal, people knew deep inside that nothing about this day was ordinary anymore. They had all witnessed something unforgettable, an act of kindness that changed everything. The two men were finally escorted out of the set, but it didn't look anything like the scene people had feared earlier. They weren't dragged or forced. They walked slowly, their shoulders lowered, their anger gone. Their faces looked tired, almost fragile. Security stayed close, but even they handled the men gently. Everyone could see these weren't villains anymore. They were simply broken men who had finally been heard. The crew stood, in silence, watching them leave. Some still had tears in their eyes, some held their breath, trying to process what had just happened. Just an hour ago, fear had filled the room, props had been knocked down, and people thought violence was about to erupt. But now the room was filled with something else entirely. Relief, awe, and a strange kind of peace. Keanu stood still for a few moments after the men were gone, his face calm, his breathing steady. He wasn't shaken. He wasn't angry. He looked thoughtful, as though he was holding on to the weight of what had just happened. Slowly, he turned back to the crew. His eyes scanned the faces of the people who had been hiding, trembling, crying, and he gave them a small nod, almost as if to say, "It's okay now." The director stepped forward, still pale. His hands were shaking as he removed his headset. He looked at Keanu with wide eyes. That wasn't acting," he whispered. His voice was filled with disbelief. The assistant director beside him wiped her cheeks, her eyes red from crying. "You saved them," she said softly, "and you saved all of us." One of the camera operators leaned against his equipment, whispering to his partner, "Did we just see what I think we saw?" His partner nodded, still stunned. "Yeah. We saw a man stop an ambush with kindness," he replied. The makeup artist, still clutching her brush, whispered a prayer under her breath, grateful that no one had been hurt. Keanu, humble as ever, shook his head gently. "I didn't save them," he said quietly. "They just needed someone to listen." His words carried across the set, making everyone pause. It was such a simple sentence, but it struck everyone deeply. The truth was clear. What had calmed the chaos wasn't force, wasn't authority, it was humanity. The extras slowly returned to their spots, still whispering among themselves. Some of them had recorded little pieces on their phones before being told to put them away. They knew that what had happened would be remembered forever. But no camera could truly capture the feeling in that room. The rawness, the fear, the compassion, it was something that lived in the hearts of the people who had been there. Later, when security gave the all clear, the crew tried to return to their work, but the energy had changed. It was no longer just another movie set. It felt like sacred. Ground every person there knew they had witnessed something rare, something that no scriptwriter could have written better. The director pulled Keanu aside. "We can postpone shooting if you want," he said. "Take the day, rest, we all need it." But Keanu shook his head calmly. "No," he said. "We should continue. Life doesn't stop when something hard happens. We move forward together." His words inspired the crew, and slowly, one by one, they returned to their roles. Still, whispers spread among them as they worked. "Did you see how he looked at them? He didn't even flinch. He gave them food, like they were guests instead of attackers." Everyone had a different detail burned into their memory, but the conclusion was the same. Keanu Reeves wasn't just an actor. He was something. More news of the event spread later, as stories always do. Some crew members couldn't help but tell their families what they had witnessed. Word traveled quickly. People outside the set began to hear about how Keanu had faced an ambush without violence, about how he had calmed two desperate men with compassion. Fans were not surprised. They always said Keanu was different, that he carried humility and kindness in a way few stars did. But even for them, this story was almost unbelievable. Inside the set, the people who had been there knew the truth. They would never forget the sound of those men crying, the silence. When Keanu spoke, the way he offered them food and water as if they were old friends. For the rest of their lives, whenever they thought of Keanu Reeves, they wouldn't just think of movies. They would think of this day, the day he showed the world that true strength comes from compassion. As filming continued, the director couldn't shake the thought from his mind. He whispered to his assistant, "Do you realize what happened today? We make films about heroes, but today we saw a real one." The assistant nodded, her eyes soft. "And it wasn't because he fought," she said. "It was because he cared." By evening, the set finally settled into quiet work again. The chaos had passed, but the memory of it lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. People moved carefully, speaking softer, as if not wanting to disturb the peace that had been created. Keanu carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, greeting the crew, thanking them, smiling gently, but the crew knew better. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary. When the day ended and people packed up their equipment, they walked away with a story they would carry forever. Some of them whispered to each other, "I'll tell my kids about this." Others simply shook their heads, unable to find the words, but everyone felt the same. Changed. Keanu left the set quietly, just as he had entered that morning. He didn't boast. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply walked out with the same humility he had carried his whole life. But behind him, he left a memory that no one would ever erase. The ambush had started with fear and danger, but it ended with compassion and kindness. And those who were there would always remember not the threat of violence, but the man who faced it calmly, the man who fed his attackers, the man who listened. On that day, the cameras may not have been rolling, but what happened was more powerful than any scene. It was real, it was unforgettable, and it proved that sometimes the greatest hero is not the one who fights, but the one who chooses kindness instead.